Oh, one came down from 7 Hills. We can be absolutely sure that he was very aware of the poetry of his time. Unlike Tolkien, who seems unconcerned with current styles, like Bandersnatch, who was later likened to. He did this way. Well, now, Georgian poets. Not quite sure how familiar people are with Georgian poets. I didn't know who was going to be here. I think I may actually be teaching my grandmother to suck exits. But I will say just a little bit about any Georgian poets anyway. Of course, the titles apply not just to those who published in the
smartphone connected
poetry. The Georgians, a sort of ill-defined movement coming in between the Victorians and modernists. They considered themselves modern, but they were soon overtaken by sharp changes in aesthetics after the First World War. Few names are remembered nowadays, other than by specialists in the period. So, for example, from Georgian Poetry, Volume 1, the names which I guess will be well known amongst the public in general are Rupert Brooke, of course, G.K. Chesterton, Walter de la Mare, D.H. Lawrence, and John Masefield. Other well-known poets, Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, and Edmund Blunden, appeared only in later volumes of Georgian poetry. The other poets achieved a reputation in their own time, but they are largely forgotten now. So perhaps it's hard for us to appreciate exactly which ones were influential for their contemporaries. And of course, there were two big names who were the major influences behind the whole movement, Thomas Hardy and A.E. Housman. So poets with a sense of a quiet lyrical pessimism, but particularly in Hardy's case, a kind of grittiness and earthiness, which was typical of the best Georgian poets, something which I think Smith rather lacks. I first came across the Georgian poets a good while ago through this book, Georgian Poetry, Penguin, selected and introduced by James Reeves, both an educator and a poet himself. This was first published in 1962. I think it's appropriate. There's a picture by Stanley Spencer on the cover, who was the same sort of period. First published in 1962, reprinted regularly over the following 20 years, and then simply went out of print. Reeves considered it time for a reappraisal of the Georgian poets, but I'm afraid he succeeded only in damning them with faint praise. According to him, features of Georgian poetry are that it is markedly English and rural in character. Its appeal to a wide audience meant that it was unspecialized and easy to understand, end of quote. So the very antithesis of modernism, which was meant for a narrow audience, was deliberately meant to be hard to understand. And I quote again, the faults of Georgian poetry at its most ordinary were technical slackness, the use of imprecise diction and facile rhythm, sentimentality of outlook, trivial and even downright commonplace themes. Okay, to put it rather kindly, I would say that the voice of the poet tries to be familiar and communicative, not formal and aloof. So there is a rejection of Victorian rhetoric in all of this. How does Smith fit into the picture? Okay, I want to look at some features of his poetry, some features of some of his poetry. I'm going to avoid poems that other speakers will specifically address. That includes the whole of his wartime poetry, which Stuart is going to look at. If you find some of my criticism negative, I apologize in advance. But after all, nobody is a perfect poet between the ages of 16 and 23. I say 16 because Tolkien believed the earliest poem in the collection dated back to 1910. There is a lot that I like in this volume, but also a lot that I think he would have grown out of in time. Okay, so Wiseman considered that Smith was, quote, still fundamentally a Victorian writer. John Garth quotes him on that. I think this is a bit unfair. I don't find any of the obvious Victorian rhetoric in his poems. Perhaps just some unnecessary poetic archaisms. When I say archaisms, I don't mean the two legends. That's deliberate. In those poems, it's an essential part of the style. But things like methinks, sans du ordinance, bronzed, a many, the redundant use of do, as in trees do fold the place. This is all a bit mannered. If there is anything Victorian, I would say, then some of the first poems are clearly backward-looking exercises. Let's take To an Elzevir Cicero, or To a Dürer Drawing of Antwerp Harbour. These are kind of metapoetic essays, I would say, reflecting on an artifact and the sense of time that it conjures up. A bit like Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn. So the old book conjures up generations of scholars who have read and been inspired by it. The picture records ships long gone to the bottom or to the breaker's yard. He says, and yet we love your image, like some song that tells of ancient days and high, because old Dürer looked upon you once and smiled. The power of art. Ancient days and high. Why are ancient days so high? It's this rather loose phrasing. Tolkien, again, might also talk about ancient days and high. He didn't in those words, but he might. But then he would have had a background to put it in. Whereas with Smith, we just have to take it at its face value. Now, I think these are essentially exercises to master a specific subgenre, and in particular, a form, the sonnet. Quite a lot of sonnets in this collection. Now, what I've just said about exercises doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad poems. Nowadays, we have become very accustomed to free verse. And looking back, in schools in Britain in the 1980s, 1990s, desperate period for English teaching, it was all self-expression. The idea is that anyone can write a poem if it comes from the heart. So that if you've grown up in that tradition, you may think that if someone wants to write a sonnet, you may even suspect them of insincerity in this. This was not so for Smith and his contemporaries. Poetry for them was an art, an artifice. It required command of the craft. So this is why I think Smith set himself this kind of exercise. The Georgians also used strict forms. Rupert Brooke, whom Smith particularly admired in his reactions to war, he wrote a set of sonnets in 1914, and I'm sure that Smith was familiar with these. Smith's sonnets, nevertheless, have a more personal and direct content. They have something of the grittiness that I mentioned just a minute or two ago. Okay, so Keats, I've mentioned the name. I find there are Keatsian echoes too in A Preface for a Tale I Have Never Told, vaguely reminiscent of On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, the evocation of the world of ancient Greek epics, windy citadels, so Homer's windy Troy, the wine-dark seas, a typical Homeric epithet, and the islands, just as in Keats. Now, of course, the poem consciously rejects these themes, saying, I'm not going to deal with all of this. The poet is going to sit on a high peak and contemplate the eternal verities, the sky, and so on. Although, of course, the huge airy peak still recalls, like stout Cortes silent upon a peak in Darien. No, Smith chooses instead a story gathered from the hills, which wandered from the west, Celtic lands. Okay. It sounds to me at this point, it's almost as if Smith is saying, you know what, I've had enough of being Keats. I think I'll be Yeats for a bit. But this poem does bring a typical Smith motif, the poet as a solitary figure in a vaguely melancholic nature. Always a bit vague. Mark Atherton says, a recurrent metaphor is one of the wind blowing constantly over the sea, the hills, the cities. Absolutely. We get these coming in frequently. But I ask myself, yes, but a metaphor for what? It's part of a repertoire of wind, clouds, sea, waves, fallen leaves. When in motion, they're all a symbol of action and passions, but also of passing time. When they're still, then they tend to be a symbol of stagnation. We get the action, the stagnation, coming into contrast quite often in these poems. The tension between a soul who would like to throw himself into the thick of it, and on the other hand, the ties of convention that hold him back. This is a bit of a German romantic topos, like Hoffmann's musician Kreisler, a creative artist who is torn between these two poles. I don't know whether Smith had ever read any Hoffmann, probably not, but he may well have known Schumann's Kreisleriana, a set of piano pieces based on this character and with rapid alternations between different moods. We got the impression yesterday that Smith was actually interested in music. I agree with that absolutely. I'll say more about it in a minute. So twice there's a mention of prisons, prison bands in Sea Poppies. Tonight the world is but a prison house in the poem just called Sonnet. This prison house, again, is reminiscent of Wordsworth's intimations of immortality. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. As he approaches adulthood, he loses the transcendental vision that he had as a child. This worry also comes in Smith's poems about the passing of time, aging, the House of Eld. The title, of course, we know comes from Stevenson. I find it difficult to see what the content of the poem has to do with Stevenson's fable. It seems to me that he's used this title to create a kind of atmosphere, the creepiness that he wanted to bring over. But seriously, how can a 20 to 22-year-old be troubled by ghosts of the past? I suspect there's influence here from Delamere. He brought out a volume of poems, The Listeners, in 1911. Some of these are actually included in Georgian Poetry, Volume 1. But in Delamere's poems, it is more psychologically motivated. The idea of ghosts is feelings of regret, sort of external manifestation of feelings of regret, feelings of guilt from the past. The idea that what has happened in the past somehow determines who you are, what you feel now. And of course, it wasn't so long before this that Ibsen had written his play called Ghosts. Not that G.B. Smith would have seen it, because the Lord Chancellor wouldn't have liked to be performed. It was about syphilis, and that wasn't proper. As far as I know, at this time, there was only one performance of it in England, as a sort of private theatre club performance, organised by GBS. It was a different GBS in this case. Growing up. Certainly Smith wrote to Tolkien on the 6th of October 1915, uncertainties about growing up and leaving his school days behind, all the more acute because he was going to war. He was concerned about all of this. What's happening to me, you know? But there is danger in too much interpretation based on biography. Not every poem is autobiographical. John Garth writes that he always displayed a misanthropic hunger for solitudes of wind and sea. I don't know whether John's got a postcard saying, "Dear John Ronald, I'm having a marvellous time at Brighton. I go down to the beach every day, avoiding the horrible crowds and enjoy the wind and the sea and things like that. I don't know, but it is possible it's an extrapolation from the poems. And you can see there's a danger here. If I say now that he wrote these poems about wind and air and sea and all of this, because this shows that he was a rather solitary person. Then I say, yes, because he was a solitary person, this is the kind of poem that he wrote. Then it's a bit circular. So I'm going to try not to do things like that. But I will at least venture this assessment. From the poem, "Oh, Sing Me a Song of the Wild West Wind," we have a stanza like, "Oh, give me a boat that is sure and stark, and swift as a slinger's stone, with a sail of canvas bronzed dark, and I will go out alone." It's a marvellous language in here, isn't there? Swift as a slinger's stone. This invites comparison with John Masefield's Sea Fever, published in 1902, rapidly becoming popular. The difference is that Masefield's poem is leaner, sparer. The emotion expressed is more direct, because Masefield had been to sea and experienced it himself. He didn't have to rely on poetic cliches. No, not poetic cliches, that's cruel. Hardy mariners, copper-skinned, or sleep in the wind's wild harmony. Well, it's better than "Hearts of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men." I'm awfully afraid that at the end, John's going to say, well, actually, I know very well that Smith was addicted to sailing. But I think this is the root of the problem. Smith's poetry is hampered by his lack of personal experience. We don't know much about his life, but from what his mother said, it seems that he was always very close to her. She said he had never left home until he went to Oxford. They had plans of what they would do together after the war. I mean, he didn't even spend very much time in Oxford as a normal undergraduate, not more than one whole year, really. There is no evidence of any romantic attachment, as far as I know, in complete contrast to his model, Rupert Brooke, who you presumably know all about. I don't know what experience he may have gained during the war to give more grounding to his poetry. Perhaps Stuart will say something about that. My impression is that for a time, his technical and intellectual competence ran on way beyond his experiential competence. If you remember, Wiseman was very doubtful about whether Smith should be invited to the Council of London, but Tolkien defended him and said, basically, okay, he will grow out of this. He will grow up a bit. He basically started. No doubt Smith would have brought these two aspects together, given a longer period of time in which to develop. Unfortunately, he died as an apprentice poet. That sounds like the last line, so I'm going to end there. I'm not. Because I think we should look at least one poem. Given more time, I would happily talk about 2 or 3 poems which I find are particularly successful, or at least partially successful. Sea Poppies, I think, gets very close to being a highly successful poem because the sea poppies are a pure symbol. There's nothing rationally to tie them in with the themes of the stagnation, wanting to burst out into a life of action, but he lets himself down with some rather hackneyed lines, not peaceful and untroubled years, but toil and warfare and passion and tears, and I would fall in valorous fight and lie on lofty far-seen height, a bit like Beowulf. Those are weak lines, so that is a partial success. His biggest success for me is Schumann, Erstes Verlust. And of course, I should say at this point, both Smith and Tolkien have got their grammar wrong. Verlust is masculine, should be Erster Verlust, but never mind. Oh, dreary fall the leaves, the withered leaves. Among the trees complains the breeze that still bereaves. All silent lies the mere, the silver mere, in saddest wise reflecting skies forlorn and sere. This is word music. We know that Smith had taken part in a French play at school. I guess he was pretty good at French. I mean, this is sort of pure Verlaine, isn't it? Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne blessent mon cœur d'une langueur monotone. It is word music. And then the longer line, would autumn had not claimed its own, and would the swallows had not flown. Skies overcast, leaves falling past, and she has passed, and left the woodland strown, the silver mere, the dying year, and me alone. Repetition of lines. It winds on. Well, of course, the mood comes from a piano piece by Schumann. From the album for the young, which Schumann wrote for his own children. My guess, this is about what we call grade 4 nowadays. I'm pretty sure that Smith learnt the piano. And why? Because this is not the sort of piece that you hear at concerts. It's for playing yourself. I'm sure that he learnt to play this piece. And the sounds of it, the rhythms of it, had stuck in his mind. Does anyone know the piece? Erste Verlust. It's a wistful sound. I'm sorry, it's piano music. It's not meant for whistling. It's not meant for singing either. But, forgive me, you'll have to bear with me, my voice is not what it was. Oh, dreary fall the leaves, the withered leaves. Little comment. Among the trees complains the breeze that still bereaves. That's your first stanza. Repeat it to the same music. All silent lies the mere, comment, the silver mere, in saddest wise reflecting skies forlorn and sere. And then the long lines, they flow more. Would autumn had not claimed its own, and would the swallows had not flown. Then it gets more difficult. The two hands do different things. And I haven't yet learnt how to sing two parts at once. Schumann at the end does very pianistic things, which couldn't be imitated in poetry. Smith imitated what Schumann is doing simply by the almost verbatim repetition of that stanza. I think this is a highly crafted piece of poetry. I think this is an indication of what Smith would have been able to do in form, in sound, once his own ideas and feelings had caught up with the rest of him. Please look at that poem, listen to the piece of music by Schumann, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Music and a show this morning. It's wonderful.
Sorry about that.
No, that was lovely. And we'll have time for questions for both of the speakers after the next presentation, so hold on to those. Next, we have Dr. Stuart Lee, who is currently the Director of Computing Systems and Services at Oxford University's Computing Services, but formerly head of the university's Learning Technologies Group, which he set up in 2001. Current research on the works of Tolkien, fantasy literature, World War I poetry, and digital humanities. He has worked extensively on Tolkien's fiction and manuscripts of publishing with interactions with the poem The Wanderer, The Battle of Maldon, interviews with the BBC. He has edited the Blackwell's Wiley Companion to J.R.R. Tolkien, and 2 editions with Solopova of The Keys of Middle-earth, and also edited the Routledge Major Works 4-volume set on Tolkien. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's always a blessing and a curse to come halfway through, because you find yourself repeating what other people have said, or at least it allows you to sort of change the things you think you should have said, but maybe didn't. And I don't think I'm going to be disagreeing with Alan at all, so that's good. So as you'll see from the title of the talk, what I want to do is explore the war poetry of Smith and to a lesser degree Tolkien by placing them within the wider corpus of British poetry, and I'm going to use British and English here synonymously because everyone else does, that arose from the Great War. And in so doing, I'm going to make a lot of general observations about the First World War and the poetry. So I can't substantiate them, so I'll draw your attention to the references at the end. And also, please speak to Grace, who's been studying this extensively for a PhD. I'm also hoping that you're very familiar with Smith's war background. I don't really have time to go through that, and John's book explains it, and Spring Harvest. From the outset, just wanted to say there are 2 key issues which we face. The first one is one we've been dodging around or picking up all through yesterday evening and today. First of all, with Smith, as we know, Spring Harvest is edited and published posthumously in 1918. It's divided into 3 sections: 2 legends, first poems, last poems, and burial of Sophocles. And in his prefatory note, Tolkien stated the 3rd part contains only poems written after the outbreak of the war. But this is ambiguous and completely unhelpful and ironic for someone like Tolkien, who was fastidious about dates and geographical distances, as we all know. And because, as we discussed yesterday, the chronology is simply all over the place. I won't go through examples of that, but I did start to think about why they might have done this. So there's only 2 reasons I could think of for Wiseman and Tolkien to get this so wrong. First of all, they just made mistakes. There's no dating on the manuscripts. And maybe they were just sort of taking a best guess. Or secondly, I wonder if they tried to shove the verse that they didn't think was particularly good, as Wiseman says, in that 3rd section because it's excused he was at the front, he was in the war. If so, that's very ironic, because when we think of the poets of the First World War, the famous ones, their pinnacle of their poetry was written while they were in combat. The poetry that comes before, and for those who survive, the poetry comes after, isn't generally very good. With Tolkien, the key problem, as I'll come back to, is that most of his opera, as Gilson called it, during the war remains under lock and key, and we have no access to it. Now, we heard yesterday a bit about the publication of Spring Harvest. Probably would have heard more if Doug had been able to present. But first of all, we know it was published by Erskine MacDonald, and I saw on the slide that Alonso put up, there was that image of the bookman, and it said published by Mr. Erskine MacDonald, which in turn was run, the publishers, by Galloway Kyle. The point is, there was no Mr. Erskine MacDonald. Mr. Erskine MacDonald was Galloway Kyle. As Dominic Hibbert and John Onions in their anthology of the Winter of the World noted, Kyle also controlled a magazine called the Poetry Review. And to quote, "To perfect an ingenious racket, young soldiers keen to publish before they were killed and grieving parents anxious to bring out memorial volumes could be drawn in by the magazine. They were then recommended by the editor, i.e. Kyle, to Mr. MacDonald, who never existed, i.e. Kyle. To extend this, the poems would then be published by Erskine MacDonald, i.e. Kyle, and favourably reviewed in the Poetry Review by Kyle." Vincent Trott in the Poetic Marketplace, in the Cambridge History of the First War, which just come out, notes both poets and the public seem to have fallen for Kyle's stunt. But these were, to quote R.W. Reynolds in his letter advising Tolkien to submit his poetry to publish, not ordinary times. Second, Smith's poetry was perfect for Erskine MacDonald, and because, as we have seen, as we know, he saw active service. Kyle undoubtedly contributed to the shaping of the canon of First World War poetry in terms of its concentration on combatants and the army in particular. For example, his 2 volumes Soldier Poets that appeared in 1916 and 1917 only focused on soldiers. There were no women, no non-combatants, and only 1 member of the Royal Flying Corps, which was part of the army at the time. None from the Navy. We won't have any truck with them. Erskine MacDonald also published memorial volumes such as The Undying Splendour by the late Sergeant J. Street, Verses and Vignettes by the late Second Lieutenant G.M. Stanton. And on the flyleaf from Spring Harvest, they ran titles like Tommy's Tunes, anything that they thought portrayed a sense of what it was like out there. So publishing a Spring Harvest was entirely in keeping with their run. Smith was authentic, a soldier. On the face of it, at least, his poetry was not critical or ironic in terms of the war. And it's important to note that Spring Harvest must have been commissioned. I don't know when it was actually commissioned, but if it comes out in June 1918, it would have been commissioned a few months before, when the war was very much in the balance. And there was a great rise in patriotic poetry in 1918. Erskine MacDonald books also sold well and became a well-known brand in the war. They cleverly marketed trench editions, which could quite neatly fit into the pockets of the army tunic. And it was publication for a mass market. But this, by its nature, also was time limited. And it was really interesting to see the number of times Smith has been anthologized, but it is very, very rare. Smith, I suspect, was lumped into the category of it was fine then, but not now poetry in the emerging canon. Finally, with reference to the contemporary context of the Spring Harvest, it's worth observing the anthologies dedicated to Lost Comrade were very common across many publishers. And Constance Rusich, in her new anthology, International Poetry of the First World War, which does anthologize one of Smith's poems, notes also proliferation of individual poems, such as Elizabeth Mansfield's To LHB, dedicated to her younger brother killed at Ypres, or Vera Britton's, perhaps, to her fiancé, Roland Leighton. So A Spring Harvest is in keeping with its times. A volume collecting together a lost comrade's poems, presented in his memory, edited by his friends, dedicated to his grieving mother, and also containing within it a poem by Smith directly in memory of another for RQG. Perhaps the most famous example of a volume edited by a friend collecting together the poetry of a fallen comrade is Siegfried Sassoon's 1920 anthology of Wilfred Owen's poems. In the introduction to the volume, Sassoon stated that the poems speak for themselves, speak for him, i.e. Owen, backed by the authority of his experience as an infantry soldier. All that was strongest in Wilfred Owen survives in his poems, any superficial impressions of his personality, any records of his conversation, behavior or appearance would be irrelevant and unseemly. And he recognizes, though, that the importance of his contribution to literature of war cannot be decided by those who, like myself, both admired him as a poet and valued him as a friend. And whilst The Spring Harvest came before Sassoon's edition, of course, there are some worthwhile comparisons. On the flyleaf of The Spring Harvest, we have a brief outline of Smith's life. But like Sassoon, Tolkien was reluctant to write too much in his introduction. Tolkien stated, beyond these few facts, no prelude and no end wise needed other than those printed as their author intended. Moreover, the desire by Sassoon to present an authentic view of Owen is reminiscent of the exchanges between Wiseman and Tolkien on how to capture a soul who is saying what it feels and how it thinks, which they did not feel Reynolds would accomplish. Wiseman suggested Smith's poems could be accompanied by explanatory notes, but this did not happen, as indeed Sassoon did not provide. The poems were left to speak for themselves. Now, before I dive into Spring Harvest, just to make a few points about war poetry, and particularly the poetry of the First World War as we perceive it now, and Alan picked some of this up. First of all, what do we mean by war poetry? Is it any poem, regardless of the date, that deals with warfare of a particular war as its theme? Or is it only a poem written during a conflict, for example, 1914 to 1918 and 1919? If the latter, we discount such famous poems as Philip Larkin's MCMXIV, then, which was written 50 years after the war. Should we only consider poems written by combatants or those who are in active service, as Galloway Carl did, or do we include poems by those who did not serve, but observed and reflected? And what do we do with a poem from the period that makes no reference seemingly to the war itself? I put up a piece of horrendous doggerel verse A simple example, I often think of you, dear, and happy moments flown, such tender memories, all of you, I cherish as my own. There's nothing here to suggest this is a war poem, apart from the fact there's an element of separation. But when you see its context, it was on one of the many postcards that the troops would send back and forth. And we can think of another famous poem like Adlestrop by Edward Thomas, which was actually talking about events before the war, although he writes it after the war is broken out. But you immediately, once you know that context, start thinking that. So the question is relevant to Smith and Tolkien, who, as we shall see, wrote poetry throughout the war, but much of it, on the face of it at least, makes no direct reference to the war itself. But really, with two intelligent, sensitive, and creative men like these, knowing full well that it was only a matter of time before they saw action, be able to ever fully put the war to the back of their minds after August 1914, should we not assume that the shadow of the war lies behind all their verse? Now, when it comes to the poetry of the First World War, we're on pretty safe ground. We all know what it looks like and who it was written by. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got a split audience. There's many colleagues and friends here from Italy. So I don't know if the same is true in Italy. The First World War has seared itself into British consciousness. I don't know if the Guerra Bianca has done, the Alpine War in Italy. So we have Somme and Passchendaele, and you have the Isonzo Valley as well. We can also pretty much trot out the names of the poets, Owen, Sassoon, Graves, Rosenberg, Gurney, and you might trot out D'Annunzio, Locchio, Barney, Ungaretti, Rabora, people like that. In Britain, though, the problem is this doesn't stand up to much scrutiny, because the poets and poems that we now read and teach as being representative, Owen's Dulce Decorum Est, were hardly read at all during the war for obvious reasons. And for the purposes of our talk, at the time Smith and Tolkien were writing. Indeed, if we look at this list, 20 most popular poems anthologized during the war, most people would not have heard of many of these poems or these poets. And I'm sure Grace could add more here because she has studied newspapers and journals. These were from anthologies. The poetry and poems that we associate with the First World War really start to emerge, or should I say become popular, in the 20s and 30s as disillusionment with the war starts to rise, and particularly in the 1960s with the 50th anniversary of the war. Popular poetry during the war could be said to be mainly patriotic, consolatory, and imbued with a sense of resolve to carry on, and notably very traditional in form and imagery. It's this vast forgotten corpus that we judge Smith and Tolkien against. Now, we've already, I think Alan talked about the fact that there was a lot of poetry in the war, and indeed this is true. Everyone was writing poetry. Everyone was familiar with poetry. Catherine Riley, in a 1973 bibliography, notes over 2,200 poets who were published in English during the war. The Times received 100 poems a day in August 1914, and so on and so on. And I think that's interesting because it just places Smith in the context of a young, educated man writing poetry. There's nothing odd about that, but it's particularly interesting with Tolkien because people often try and make an allusion between Tolkien and Morris and go, isn't it interesting that Morris starts with verse and then moves to prose? And Tolkien does the same thing to a degree. Well, yes and no, but what's more interesting, or more obvious, is that Tolkien is writing verse, as most of his friends were, after a bit of encouragement. As Smith states in Save That Poetic Fire, human beings would be less than the least of things if it wasn't for poetry and song. So, looking at Smith's poetry in Spring Harvest, a few points which have already been made, and I'm concentrating on the third form. So they, as Alan said, they adhere to standard forms. We don't have anything like contemporary poets like T.H. Hume, H.D., Richard Aldington, who were playing around with modernist verse. In fact, English poetry just doesn't have any truck with that nonsense until after the war, it feels like. So in Italian and French poetry, it's much more common, of course. And we shouldn't be surprised by this, as Alan said, Smith and his contemporaries were, it was ingrained into them, the poets, the classic poets of the time. And also, what was ingrained into them was a Latin or a classical education. Now, I'm going to park that there because looking at Becky's handout, he picks this up and he mentions Elizabeth Vandiver's book, which is fine. We also discover, I think, that Smith was an accomplished poet, an accomplished apprentice, let's leave it at that. He could write sonnets, as Alan already said. He's quite good at a Petrarchian sonnet, a Shakespearean sonnet. He even mixes the two. just for fun. And it reminds me, if you remember in Parade's End, Christopher Teachings has that scene where they just have a battle and how quickly can each of them write a sonnet. It was just the sort of thing that educated men could do. He understood metre and its effects. For example, in an earlier poem, Legend, he cleverly moves from blank verse to a trochaic tetrameter for lines spoken by the enchanted monk and back again to create a different tone. He makes regular use of juxtaposition, repetition, anaphora, personification. The example of personification which immediately leapt out to me was in Intercessional, The Voices of the Great Guns, April 1916, The Great Gun's Voice, which is very much like Wilfred Owen's The Big Gun Guffawed in his poem The Last Laugh. And he draws on the standard imagery of classical and romantic poetry, Muse, Mount, Steed, and even the ubiquitous lark, you can't escape them, makes an appearance in Over the Hills and Hollow Green. As Alan said, we know he read the 1915 edition of Georgian poetry at least, and the poems of Rupert Brooke, but he doesn't follow the what we might call the principles of Georgian poets who hated poetic verbosity. And this has been covered by Alan, just a few examples of some of the archaic, tortuous, you would say, diction that Smith employs. Moreover, Georgian poetry is often labelled, indeed criticised, as being rather buoyant and optimistic. It's not quite true, but I would suggest it's certainly nothing we would say is ubiquitous to Smith's verse, and would agree with Hammond and Scull's observation that his later poems during the war became noticeably dark, and John's detection of pessimism and a rationalist despair. Moving from style to theme, let's have a look at a couple that emerge from Ash. I mentioned earlier much of the poetry arising during the First World War was very patriotic. Were it not being overtly so, it did at least attempt to encourage resolve in the individual and the nation to continue the fight, or consolation for those who've lost. And it would be wrong to label Smith as patriotic along the lines of a Kipling or a Harold Begbie or a Jesse Pope, but he does at least portray a patriotic view in a poem like Anglia Valida in Senectute, subtitled On the Declaration of War. But even then, it's understated compared with something like Robert Bridges' England Awake. Although perhaps in Awakening, Smith's poem, we get nearer the sentiment. Smith's sonnet to the Smith's sonnet to the British Navy is riven with a celebration of the Navy, of course, defines as evident that this isle was ne'er attained and ne'er shall be, and he likens the strength of the Navy vessels to his own fragile body going into danger, a small vessel of one Smith ill-wrought, the pun on Smith, his surname, and the Smiths who built the iron ships. The poet ends with a prayer to God for resolve, which is very similar in many ways to the most popular English poem of the First World War, which you probably never ever heard of, Hymn for the Men at the Front by John Oxenham, which sold by the millions. Now, due to time, I'll focus on just one theme that runs through Smith's poetry, the concept of then and now. Many First World War poets concentrate on analysis of the present, temporal and physical, and compared it with the past. The simple example would be Ivor Gurney, whose anthology Severn and Somme flips back and forth between the experiences on the Somme and the locations in pre-war Gloucestershire. Smith plays with this in Domum Reddit Poeta. Poet returns home where his memory strays to the undiminished treasury of small delights of home. And there's a sense of nostalgia here, and in a more abstract way in Over the Hills and Hollow Vales. Ave Atque Vale, published in, as we've heard already, works in a similar way, but this time the point of departure from there is Oxford to the war. As a footnote, it's notable how often First World War poets use Oxford as a touchstone for comparison, partly because the background of the poets, they were educated here, so they knew it, but partly because I think it's a symbolism of what England could be, or it's what they were fighting for. So Lawrence Binyon's Oxford in wartime, Winifred Letts, The Spires of Oxford, but for this audience, most notably C.S. Lewis's Oxford in his Spirits in Bondage, where he says it was the one city that is nothing of the beast. Smith develops the theme of then and now in various ways. In We Who Have Bowed to Time, the opening stanza compares the long summer hours of the past immediately with the fierce and warlike muse of the present, the placid life of bygone days as compared with the sterner days he now faces. The sonnet to the British Navy talks about the past being peaceful, Dark is the world of our fathers, left us, the past is described as golden, and the present of hope bereft. But in this poem, the closing verse, repeating the first, comes with the need for resolve encouraged by the spirits and souls of the heroes olden. And Smith uses a similar device in Ave Atque Vale, where the first stanza is repeated at the end, providing consolation, the fact that Oxford is evermore the same. Resolve and consolation, as I have noted, are common to First World War poetry, and with Smith it comes up again and again. To resolve to carry on is the message of "Oh, one came down from the Seven Hills," and to his sonnet to the British Navy. And consolation can not only be found in the survival of Oxford, but also in the survival and existence of a free England, as evident in April 1916 poem, which closes with the presumably unironic sentiment that many find consolation and happiness in England's continued survival. Inspiration for resolve can be drawn from the past with the former heroes olden, days gone by, and he interweaves myth and legend, as we've heard quite a bit. And I think we talked yesterday about some of the myths, certainly about the Western Isles and so on. But the past is also the time of myth with the high gods, presumably some atheist pantheon, who he consistently references to emphasize that the past, the then, is now gone. This trope is used again, to allow him to consider the future. A good example is evident in Afterwards, where with the departure of the old gods' hate on the riven earth, and when weapons of war are all outworn, it will be for the next generation to rebuild the earth. So he's playing around with ideas that the past can be golden, the present bereft of hope, the past can be inspirational through legend, but the past can also be negative. The old dead years, and he consistently uses the images being referenced of dead leaves falling from trees, from sere branches, but also prison and prison bars, which I don't think has been mentioned so far. For Smith, whilst there is a darkness in the situation his generation found themselves, there is hope as he looks to the future and future possibilities. In his poem, The New Age and the Old age is swept away, and the new age, presented in optimistic terms, stems from High God himself. This is a time of rebirth, joy, and perhaps even innocence. Again, constant use of children, or regular use of children in his poetry to convey that is quite interesting. Now, this bears some similarity to what was known as the condition of England at the time, where there was a feeling that England and the empire were slipping into decline, and the war could be seen as purgative, to quote John, of the old and the chance for renewal. A very famous being example is Rupert Brooke, sonnet Peace, by God be thanked, who has matched us with this hour and caught our youth and awakened us from sleeping. And we can trace elements through the writings of the TCPS, which might be playing around with some of these ideas. And in 1912, there is that debate about the world has become over-civilized. But in November 1914, Tolkien, in a letter to Wiseman, starts to list what the beliefs of the TCPS might be. Supreme importance should be given to the promotion of religion, matrimony, and the duty of patriotism, the duty of patriotism, but averse belief in nationalism are, to me, of vital importance. Gilson, in a letter to Tolkien, 31st of October 1915, spoke of the sheer evil filth of immorality affecting England, and Smith, only a week before, wrote to Tolkien of his hope about what the TCPS could lead to. He also looks forward to a time when characters like Douglas Cole, who was a historian and unionist and borderline pacifist, and the ubiquitous George Bernard Shaw would no longer be listened to. As the darkness drew in on Smith, he became more bitter, noting in a letter of the 11th of August 1916 that the English nation is very far indeed from its highest point. The days when masculinity, vigour, and a kind of honest humour have now gone. And he concludes with an extremely vitriolic attack on the home front and on women, akin perhaps to Sassoon's poems like Blighters and The Glory of Women. There's one unavoidable theme that runs through Smith's poetry, and that is death. He begins musing on death's probability, and in this he resembles the poet Charles Hamilton Sorley, who talks about in All the Hills and Vales Along, a marching troop, the singers are the chaps who are going to die perhaps. A very similar sentiment is evident in Anglia Valida, where Smith begins to wonder whether his own road is almost done, and he realizes only God knows it'd be ours to see again, Oxford. In We Who Have Bowed, he returns to the topic under different, almost resigned to the inevitability of death. We must, with all men, come to dust. Death and past are fused in his poem Memories, where he uses a device very like Robert Graves with the idea of the ghosts. Robert Graves uses it in Corporal Stare, though in a much more sinister way, where Smith sees the pale shades of lost comrades, who now are shapes in the mist. And in his letters, there are constant references to death. 3rd of February 1916, he notes death is so close to us now, and describes or uses the word impuissant, powerless, possibly to reflect death or his situation. Life, he notes, has changed from the journey of the simple sparrow that Grace mentioned yesterday from Anglo-Saxon literature. And finally, most darkly perhaps, reminiscent of his comment after the death of Gilson, that there is no doubt Rob is to be envied in some ways. After all, he's out of the great struggle of life. In his poem, O long the fiends of war shall dance, he writes, the mould is better than the rose. Now, I've only got a few minutes left, I think, have I? So let's turn to this chap. Now, albeit, briefly, on the face of it, it's very easy to see why Janet Brennan Croft wrote this in her book some years ago. Tolkien's writings from the time of Britain's declaration of war to the time he shipped back to England show little or no influence of the events of the Great War. They are fantasies focusing mainly on the beauty and splendour of the elves. However, if we do take a look at Tolkien's poetry from 1914 to 1918 in the light of my previous discussions about what war poetry is, we can perhaps get a different view. In doing so, I am very conscious of the fact that I am relying entirely on John's research, who, of course, would be unquestionable, and Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull for their extensive research into what appears. And there are problems with this, of course, but basically, we don't have access to the manuscripts. So, to begin with, we know that Tolkien was writing poetry. I think it's going back to about 1910, he's writing poems. But let's start thinking about war poetry and trying to categorize it. So a few poems fall into the category of being started before the war, but then revised or rewritten after it. Morning, evening, outside, as you can see, I've put the dates up there. And when I put in brackets, that's an alternative title. All of those are unpublished. We then have one poem, The Horns of Ilmer, which was started before August 1914, I believe, but worked on after he enlisted late June 1915 at some point or other. And this is available in The Shaping of Middle-earth, but it's a good example of the issues you have to deal with Tolkien. They have very, very complicated history, his poetry, because Tolkien, no surprise to anyone, was a constant rewriter and reworker of his work, but not a very good publisher of it. So just in this poem alone, it began life as The Grimness of the Sea in 1912, I think. It then was renamed The Tides. It then becomes Sea Chant of an Elder Day, Sea Song of an Elder Day, Horns of Ulmo, Horns of Ilmir. So without seeing the manuscripts, it's very possible that when I list some of these poems, they might actually be the same poem. So, forgive me on that, but we're living in the time where we are. Once the war started, the poems fall into two categories, those begun after August 1914, but before he enlisted, and those begun after he enlisted. I don't have time to go through these. These are poems after the outbreak of war, but before he enlisted. And just to say, all the ones underlined are the ones we can read. The ones not underlined, I believe, but I may be wrong on that, are the ones we don't have access to. Perhaps more interestingly, for the perspective of this talk, are those poems we know he wrote during active service, i.e. after the 28th of June 1915, until he was demobbed. These tend to point to his mythology, so that first bullet point, there's a long list of poems there, which all seem to sort of link around his mythology. But what about the three written whilst he was in training? Thoughts on Parade, Dark are the Clouds about the North, The Pool of the Dead Years, Pool of Forgetfulness. One poem we know really well is The Lonely Isle. It was published in Leeds University Verse in 1914-24 and republished by John. And looking at it out of context, you'd assume it's a poem about the Elven Isle, straight out of the mythology. But again, like the poem I showed earlier in that postcard, once we know the context, it possibly takes on a separate light. It's written, I think, 6th of June, 1916, just when he arrives at Etaples, the big British training camp. And it's dedicated, note, to England. So it suggests it's more probable that he reflects his thoughts, fused with his mythology maybe, around his departure from England for the uncertainty of war. A lot of what we've observed with Smith is here: traditional form, rhyme structure, archaic language, fusion of myth, fairy, even the image of children as well. So we're now into the point where he's at the front. There are two poems he writes around at Bouzencourt on the 6th to 8th of July when he's with Smith. A Dream of Coming Home, A Memory of July in England. He does rework them a bit later on, but the first one, for example, he notes on the manuscript, we are told, that to my wife, Bouzencourt, July 4 to 8, 1916. Two more poems can be dated from his experience at the trenches at Deepole. The Thatch of Poppies and the Forest Walk. And I've done the little map here, which just shows you that this line here is the front line of the Battle of the Somme. So Deepole Wood, you can see if he is writing it there in the headquarters, he's right in the thick of it. He then enjoys a period of respite whilst undergoing training at Francoville. I should say Bouzencourt isn't far off this map, the map just didn't extend. Well, he's training at Francoville, and from here we have the poem Consolatrix Afflictorum, which possibly is about Mary, because it's a title usually associated with her, but it becomes Stella Vespertina. He returns to the trenches in Thiepval in the attempt to take the Schwaben Redoubt, but I can't see any verse from that period. But once he's taken ill, he's moved to the officers' hospital at Gézancourt, and there he writes Morning Tea. And as he returns home, and he's moved around hospital until eventually he finds himself back at Great Haywood, that's the time, perhaps, for the first time, he has time to reflect on the loss of GBS, which he writes possibly on Christmas Day 1916. And then to conclude, we have another poem in late 1917, Companions of the Rose, and who knows what Brothers in Arms from 1919 to 20. So at a rough estimate, 12 poems written after he enlisted, chronologically taking us through his training, his embarkation to France, his life at the front, his time in hospital, and his reflections on the loss of his friends. Of these, only one, I believe, has been published, and all the rest are still under embargo. What style, what sentiments, what references to the war, how these intertwine with his mythology, and so on, we can only guess at. There are some clues in Smith's letters to Tolkien where he notes some weaknesses in the poems that he saw, especially around Tolkien's syntax. It's interesting, Smith's syntax isn't great, so if he thought Tolkien's was bad, where he notes sentence structures where there are a lot of different tropes and adjectives in about half a sentence, and concludes it's often damn difficult to make out. In two of Smith's letters, he does do a bit of a quote from Tolkien's poems. I think it's the Horns of Ylmir and probably Copernicus and Ptolemy, but I can't read them out because if I did, I'd have to shoot you. So I will just finish with a couple of bits of what-if-ery. What if Tolkien's poetry from 1914 to 18 was released? What could we learn from that? How would it compare if we put him alongside Smith or C.S. Lewis's, or maybe even the more poets like Owen and Sassoon? But perhaps the biggest what-ifs are back with Smith. Absent from his verse, for example, are some of the key themes we normally encounter in soldier poets. Sympathy for his men and their suffering, sympathy for the enemy, any mention at all, even oblique, to the trenches and the experience of the front line. Now we know, I mentioned this yesterday, in Tolkien's manuscripts, there is a table of contents for Ash where several poems were not selected, but don't know what they were about, but especially intriguing are titles like In the Field and OC Corps. Were they more a reflection of life on the front line? But more importantly, and I'll just leave you with this, what if he had survived, or dare one conjecture in a flight of fancy, have been so traumatized by what he'd seen in 1916 and going into 1917, that midpoint through 1917, he was declared unfit for service and sent to Craiglockhart, where he would have rubbed shoulders with Sassoon, Graves and Owen. Would his poetry have moved in directions? We shall never know. Thank you.
And we have ample time for all of your questions for either Stuart or Alan. Yes.
So thank you, Alan. Your singing of Smith's poem brought me to tears, so that was really lovely. Thank you for that. I just wanted to take slight issue perhaps with the idea that Smith didn't have a lot of life experience before writing his poem. That is true, largely speaking. I do want to point out though that he had lost his father by the time he began writing, and his father actually died very suddenly. And I can tell you as someone who lost a parent suddenly at an older age than Smith, but I can only imagine what it was like. I think if he lost a parent at around 11, I think correct me on that, if that's wrong, but I do think that that could have a seismic impact on any poems about ghosts, which of course could have had a lot of literary precedent as well, and influence, but I wouldn't underestimate that event in his life. And later letters did suggest that he really filled a special role in the family with his mother because of that early loss. And it also gave him a lot. He had a lot in common with Tolkien in that way, because Tolkien lost both his parents. And that was one of the things that really deeply connected them. And also a point about nature, he was actually, he did take a lot of walks, at least in Oxford, as one of the reviews in his poetry said. Maybe Bernard Brown said he couldn't keep up with him because he walked so swiftly. And so I think that his love of nature and poetry is coming from experience where he did walk in nature. It was very common for a lot of people to see walks at that time. And so I think that there was perhaps more experience, both tragic and happy, with the nature that we are here of.
Thank you. I accept that happily. This thought had crossed my mind. This is what I was thinking of when I asked John yesterday about what about his brother? Trying to think about the relationship within the family, and of course thinking about the ages they had both been when their father died. But it is feelings like this. I don't know whether he actually repressed feelings because of this. I was very interested in what Stuart said just at the end, that no thoughts about his men. He may have had the thoughts privately, but nothing that comes out in his poetry, anything of that kind. You get hardly anything in the way of personal, concrete feelings. It's all suffused into this hazy nature. So yes, you look at it from one side, I look at it from a slightly different side. There is something in Smith's psychology which we don't understand.
Well, there are pursuits in this and commemoration poems to RQG, which are quite personal as well. So that's more.
They are quite personal. Sorry, I know John wants to say something, but you've mentioned about, I wasn't thinking so much of for RQG, I was thinking of, let us tell quiet stories of kind eyes. Okay, the idea that three of them are sitting together by the fire, and it's as if there is an extra presence, excuse me, in the room. Okay, Tolkien talks about the cauldron of tales, and there's sort of like a cauldron of poetic ideas too. It struck me, there was a direct parallel between this poem and a poem in Delamere's The Listeners, which was also reproduced in the first volume of Georgian poetry, which is a mother reading a story to her two children, and there's another spirit that comes in unnoticed to the others and listens to the story. Delamere doesn't spell out what it is, my interpretation. This is another child who has died, is present in the minds of all of them, but never actually addressed. I'm not saying, obviously, that Smith deliberately copied that. It sticks there in the mind.
Just a few disconnected thoughts here. From what you're just saying, Alan, I'm getting the impression that what we're looking at is almost a sociological thing of, a generation, an era that we look at from the outside, and it appears opaque and strange to us because we've seen what became the dominant discourse afterwards, the discourse of disillusionment and so on. So from that point of view, you can see that if Smith had got to Craig Lockhart and had chats with Sassoon, as Owen did, maybe that would have cleaned the windows, to borrow a Tolkienian phrase, and he could have found ways of using his real lived experience as a touchstone for poetry that now would speak to us more effectively. But again, at that point in time, the outcome for poetry was hanging in the balance, wasn't it? Or even the balance would seem to be with the traditional poetry, which seems to us in retrospect at least, to trammel up the voice, the voice of experience of the horrors of the First Soul. And you get in the instances of the dead being around us in sort of communion afterwards. Isn't that kind of thing on the trajectory of the the real post-war obsession with seances and so on, that Arthur Conan Doyle bought into? There is a curious comparison actually, because there was a possible member of the TCBS who did end up at Craig Lockhart Psychiatric Hospital, and that was George H. Bonner, who was a friend of Smith's, a little younger than Tolkien, I think possibly a year younger than Smith, who wrote poetry and published. He was quite ambitious. He survived the war, committed suicide in 1927, I think, because of his war trauma. He never recovered from it. His poetry is all there in Magdalen College archives, and it's, you can make comparisons with Smith. It's not so accomplished, and going to Craig Lockhart didn't improve it. One last point, the idea of being 16 or 20 and feeling like the old days were better. I remember first feeling a sense of nostalgia, deep nostalgia, when I heard American Pie, with the line about good old boys drinking whiskey and rye, and all. This will be the day that I die. So I was probably 4 or 5 when this was on the radio, and I remember at the age of 10 thinking, well, that's it, childhood's over. So, I mean, yes, you can look on that as affectation, but it's a very subjective thing.
I think a few things to say, and in reply, which I agree with. I think, so if we take the famous poets. So Robert Graves starts to write about the real experiences once he's seen the trenches, and he tells Sassoon, "You'll change your verse," because Sassoon's writing quite, it's not particularly good Brookean poetry before he gets out there. And he says you're going to change once you start seeing it, and Sassoon does change, and then it goes from trauma. And Owen, the catalyst for Owen is obviously meeting Sassoon and Graves, the Craig Lockhart case. But the point I would make is they're not the norm. We think they're the norm now, looking back on the poetry, but they are not the norm, and I don't know if Grace would agree. The majority of poetry you read that was produced in the First World War by soldier poets or by non-combatants is patriotic, consolatory verse. So Smith is actually quite a typical First World War poet. It's just that what's been drilled into us at O-level with GCSE and so on, you don't think so. There are certain things I think he is missing. And it may have come where I don't detect a concern in his poetry, or at least an empathy or a pity for the suffering of his men. But that may have come, and that often does come out. Even if it's not critical, poets would often write about the situation, particularly the officers and the men that they had in their charge. But that could well have come, and you can, if we go on the chronology, you can see there is a darkening of his poetry. I think you talk about this and others do, so something may have emerged here. There's no reference, as I said, to the enemy. Now, often the soldier poets would sympathise with the enemy, didn't there? Was a lot of German bashing at home, but the soldiers on the front were experiencing what the people on the other side of no man's land were experiencing. So you do get a fair bit of that. So there's a few things missing which are odd, but they may have come. But I would think he's kind of like a typical First World War poet, which is that we don't think that. I don't know, Grace, you?
I just wanted to point out, I looked at one of the letters of one of the TCBS letters, and I think it was Wiseman to Tolkien, and they were talking about Euclid's Companions of the Rose, which is not available, but Wiseman was commenting on it. And he said something to the effect of, no need to cross out these two lines. He didn't say what the two lines are, except that it hinted that there was some anti-German feeling that comes to the poem by Tolkien. Obviously, this is in the context of Smith's death and Tolkien's feeling nearly raw at this point. And so I thought that we don't have this poem, but it's interesting that he gives a little bit of a hint of at least some of the content of two lines and the pain and anguish coming out of those two lines in Tolkien. And we don't have the lines, but we have a little bit of the sense of a part of what might be.
Mark, did you have?
It's kind of and some other ideas really on contexts. And I wanted to ask what you both thought about the fact when you make an anthology. My first thought, I've got two thoughts. When you make an anthology or a collection, of course the chronology is very important, and it's very good to try and reconstruct that. But there's another idea really, which is to put poems on a similar theme together, and they resonate then with each other. And some poems that we've heard about today or yesterday may actually improve in quality by being companion pieces to other poems, which add depth to them. That would be my first thought. And the second thought is about mythology. And I don't know as much as I perhaps should on to what extent did Smith know about Tolkien's mythology, and perhaps draw on it slightly when he was writing his poems. Certainly they were both interested in the Mabinogion and in Arthurian mythology, and both drew on it, and I think there are some parallels to be made with, I mentioned that this afternoon, between Tolkien's Fall of Arthur and some of Smith's poems. So those two things about context.
So on the first one, I think the creation of anthologies is obviously a fine art, and it comes with all kinds of decisions. Hugh Houghton, I think, has written a lot on anthologies from both wars, which is extremely interesting. So yes, the problem we've got is the statement that Tolkien makes at the beginning, which of course, everyone has read that. Oh right, so the third part is war poetry, or it's written up, but clearly it's just not right. But he may well be putting things together, or they may well have been putting things together and similar things. Although when I read it, I was finding things dotted about repeatedly, all through the spring and harvest, and it was only as I began to realise, well, maybe these aren't in chronological groupings, that perhaps explains it, but it would be lovely to see what they are. There is a danger, of course, in that. I referenced the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the 50th anniversary of the First World War, there was one message that people wanted to send out, and that was that the war was completely futile and awful. It tied into the 60s counterculture revolution, etc. The BBC put the Great War on. So the anthologies that came out in the 60s start to group things to push that message up the line to death. I think Brian Gardner's a very famous one, and it's all over the place. You've got poems written in 1914 next to poems written in 1917 because they kind of say the same thing, and you're led to believe, right, because London's put his stamp on it, that what we're seeing here is that classic paradigm that Elizabeth Vanquer mentions, of everyone was naive and stupid at the beginning, and Rupert Brooke and Julian Grenfell, and then the song came along and everyone was Sassoon and Owen and Graves, and it's just not true, because as I said, in 1918 they are still producing a lot of patriotic verse because they think the war could be lost at any time if the Germans haven't defeated Russia.
and the battle on the Western Front en masse. The Americans are nowhere near.
Yeah, okay, can I just?
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with Stuart absolutely on that. Obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages in putting these poems in an anthology, grouping them by theme. I think some work very well. The group I mentioned at the beginning, Rhyme, Elizabeth Cicero, York River Returns, etc., Black Country, and so on. Then we get on to what I said about winds and seas and leaves and things like that, which is why I would like to know more of the chronology. I asked myself, is this an idea that stuck in his mind over several years? Or were these winds and leaves and so on something that bothered him at a particular time in his development? He was working through it and trying to find the optimal poetic expression for this. Perhaps he would not have published all of these poems if he had lived. He might have chosen some and not others. The impression that I get very strongly, like I got when I first read these poems, it reminds me of the story, probably apocryphal, of Arthur Dyson, who Tolkien was reading. Oh no, not another effing elf. I thought something similar about not another leaf, not another seed, something like that.
Just so, if I may, just a quick comment on what might Smith known of Tolkien's mythology. Well, where was Tolkien's mythology in 1916? We have a few early Arundel poems. What else do we have?
Actually, in some of Smith's letters from the war era, he mentioned the Arundel opera, so it sounds like he had a couple of Arundel poems at that time, and he had some other ones as well, Criterion among the Trees. So he definitely was, had several mythological poems available to him, so he did something, yeah.
And there's a letter from Wiseman to Tolkien in March 1916, where Wiseman mentions the Eldar, the Solasimpe, and the Nolderly. So clearly, Wiseman at least knew of these things, unless it's simply that Tolkien had just mentioned them in his previous letters to Wiseman. But it sounds to me like he was talking about something that Wiseman understood. So it seems clear to me that there was a lot of conversation there. You know, the fact is, you only have letters because people are communicating while they're apart. But the key points when Tolkien and Smith would have been communicating would have been when Smith was at Corpus and Tolkien up the road at Exeter. And who knows? It was, I imagine, it was rather like, you know, the laying foundations for both of their imaginative development. And you know, influence from one on the other is impossible to get, I think. In that one.
Denise.
Yes, when you compare Tolkien and Smith, you see that Tolkien has, because of his love for Edith, has by that time produced a vast amount of love poetry. And love is a sort of very powerful theme that's from very, very early on. And there isn't anything that can be directly detectable in Smith's poetry, because, as you said, there's very, very little sense of any attachments, whether, at least certainly not female, although there may be some male attachment, especially considering the importance that he attached to the relationship of Robert Gilson, and how it deeply affected him when Gilson died, and you seem to see that the poem that comes afterwards are all about despair and death and dust. And he may have had some sort of male attachment, whether it was sexual or just affectionate, emotional, and of course it would not be something that would have been acceptable to discuss or write about, except extremely obliquely, like in the reference to Hans Mariner's Copperskind, and the kiss of Apollo at the end. But apart from that, there's very little else, and one could expect that he might have some sort of attachments, and maybe if he had had some with his soldiers, they would have been even less expressible, and then they would not have been able to appear in something like this.
Yeah, I think what I was referencing on the last point, I agree with everything you said, was probably more like poems we talked about Amy Mackintosh, an officer who just deeply cares and expresses, I don't think necessarily in a homoerotic way, just a love for a soldier who's died, yeah, his care and the anguish. He says it's more, I'm more upset than the father is at losing this boy. And yeah, so what you're saying there, there's a love of place, there's a love of time, and there is a love, as you say, for RQG and the TCBS. The letter which I quoted, which, I didn't quote, sorry, I referenced, is quite interesting, where he does get what we would call misogynistic about women in there. Now, it's celebrating masculinity and vigor, and I can't remember what else. And it's talking about all of the problems at the time around women and so on like that. So there is that there, but, Sassoon writes the same. At the time, Sassoon is having probably a nervous breakdown by even his own account. So there were these boys basically were going through horrendous trauma, and they were going back and forth between normality and this, and their minds were all over the place. So I never read too much into that, but I just thought it was an interesting comparison with Sassoon.
You said it's still these boys.
Well, they were, yeah.
Well,
Let's just have one more before, I don't want to hold you from your coffee too much. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to one of the earlier poems, the one about the artwork by Joe of Antwerp. Alan, you talked about the influence of music. Do you think there's any influence you can see from artwork, from art hip? And then a question for Stuart. I wanted to ask, you talked about the unpublished poems, how likely it is of Tolkien that we may see those one day.
Okay, one about the sonnet. It is essentially about the power of art, isn't it? To hold up time, if you like. Gives us the ability to see through time. The fact that this was a visual form of art, as opposed to the book, the early edition of Cicero, I think shows that Smith was interested in a wide range of creative expression. Was that what you're asking me, or by Mr. Point?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So on Tolkien's manuscripts, well, there might be people in the room who know more than me, but so I wondered if this would come up. So what could I say? I'm very supportive of the estate. I understand all the trials and trauma that they go through in terms of trying to protect Tolkien's, legacy. However, to my knowledge, he is the only poet of the First World War I cannot have access to the manuscripts. And the First World War, I think, is a national cause. We've been trying to understand it and trying to make sense of it for 100 years, and we still keep coming back to it. So to not see the poems written by one of the greatest figures of the 20th century and what his reaction was 105 years after the war has ended. So then you ask, well, why is it under embargo? Does he say something in it that the estate doesn't want to go out? I doubt it. Are they too fragile? Certainly not. So the only thing I can conjecture is that they think there is money in them, and that probably very soon we're going to see an edition, I hope, of Tolkien's poetry in which but that's why you can't even see them.
Yeah, they're all embargoed.
Yeah.
There's a blanket embargo on all the poetry.
Yeah, exactly. So that you've got to guess that what we're going to get in the narrative is poetry of J.R.R. Tolkien coming out, in which they will appear, which is fine.
Yeah.
Well, is it fine?
Between the barrel and everything else, after all.
I mean, there's so much poetry there, obviously, that, and it's the mythology, but it would just be nice to see a dozen poems of what he was writing, particularly at all those unknowns.
But anyway, we got Lewis's. Yep. Had that for some time.
Well, let's thank Stuart and Alan for two really wonderful presentations.